Toddler gifted his pacifier to crying bear cub. That simple act started a forest truce. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The golden afternoon sun filtered through the towering pines, casting dappled shadows across the wooden cabin nestled in the heart of Whispering Pines Forest. Inside, 3-year-old Noah Bennett stood on his tiptoes by the open window, his favorite blue pacifier dangling from his mouth as he watched butterflies dance in the wildflower meadow. His mother, Sarah, hummed softly as she prepared dinner, occasionally glancing at her son with a warm smile. "Look, Mama." "Pretty." Noah pointed excitedly at a monarch butterfly that had landed on the windowsill, his pacifier bobbing as he spoke. "Yes, sweetheart, it is beautiful." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and joined him at the window, ruffling his sandy curls. The forest is full of wonderful creatures. Beyond the peaceful meadow that surrounded their cabin, a group of 5 children from the nearby summer camp trampled through the underbrush. 12-year-old Mason led the pack, a sturdy stick gripped in his hand as he swung it at low-hanging branches. "I bet we can find that bear cave Counselor Rick was talking about," Mason declared, his voice sharp against the forest's tranquility. "My dad says bears are dangerous and should be scared away." "I brought some rocks," his friend Zach added, jingling his pockets, "just in case." Emma, the youngest of the group at 9 years old, frowned. "My mom says we should leave wild animals alone." "Your mom isn't here," Mason scoffed, pushing deeper into the forest. Meanwhile, not far from the cabin, a small black bear cub with a distinctive white patch on its chest had wandered away from its mother. Curious and playful, the cub followed the scent of wildflowers into the meadow. Its mother, a large female bear the local rangers had named Willow, was busy teaching its sibling how to find juicy grubs under fallen logs deeper in the forest. The cub, whom the rangers called Scout, sniffed at a cluster of bright purple coneflowers, batting at them with soft paws. Its dark eyes widened with delight as a bumblebee buzzed nearby. Scout was still young, only 5 months old, and experiencing his first spring in the forest. Everything was new and fascinating. Noah pressed his small hands against the window screen, completely captivated by the bear cub that had wandered into view. "Teddy! Big Teddy, Mama!" he squealed, pointing frantically. Sarah gasped, nearly dropping the wooden spoon she held. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, instinctively pulling Noah away from the window. "That's not a teddy, sweetheart. That's a real bear cub." "Bear cub," Noah repeated, his eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. He clutched his pacifier tighter, watching a Scout pawed at a dandelion, sending white fluff floating into the air. "We need to stay very quiet," Zara said softly, her heart racing as she scanned the meadow for signs of the mother bear. The last thing she wanted was to be caught between a protective mother and her cub. She reached for her phone on the counter, intending to call the local forest ranger. Before she could dial, shouts erupted from the edge of the meadow. The group of children burst through the trees, their voices shattering the peaceful scene. "Look, a bear!" Mason yelled, pointing at Scout, who froze at the sudden noise. "It's just a baby," Emma said, her voice tinged with awe. "Still dangerous," Mason insisted, his grip tightening on his stick. "My dad says even the little ones can hurt you." Scout, startled by the loud voices, let out a frightened whimper and backed away, stumbling over a fallen branch. The cub's eyes darted around for an escape route, but the children had spread out, unintentionally blocking the path back to the forest. "Let's scare it away," Zach suggested, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a smooth stone. With a quick flick of his wrist, he sent the stone flying. It landed with a thud just inches from Scout, causing the cub to let out a terrified cry that pierced the air. Inside the cabin, Noah's expression changed from wonder to concern. The pacifier dropped from his mouth, dangling by its clip attached to his overalls as he heard the cub's distress call. It sounded so much like his own cries when he was hurt or afraid. "Bear crying, Mama," Noah said, his lower lip trembling in sympathy. "Bear sad." Sarah looked out the window, horror washing over her face as she witnessed the children's cruelty. "Those kids need to stop," she muttered, snatching up her phone again. "They're going to get themselves killed if the mother shows up." Noah's tiny fingers clutched at the window screen, his eyes never leaving the frightened cub. Scout had curled into a ball, trembling as another stone landed nearby. The cub's cries grew more desperate, a sound so pitiful it made Noah's heart ache in his small chest. In that moment, something stirred within Noah, an instinct older than words, a connection that transcended species. He unclipped his pacifier from his overalls and held it tightly in his fist, a determined look crossing his face. "Noah, stay here," Sarah instructed as she moved toward the door, intending to shout at the children to leave the cub alone. But Noah was quicker than his mother anticipated. With the silent determination only a toddler could muster, Noah pushed open the screen door that Sarah had forgotten to latch and toddled out onto the porch, his beloved pacifier clutched in his small hand. The wooden boards creaked under his tiny feet as he made his way down the 3 short steps to the meadow. Sarah turned at the sound of the door, her heart leaping into her throat. "Noah!" she cried, lunging for her son. But he was already making his way across the grass, his short legs carrying him toward the frightened bear cub and the group of children who were too focused on their target to notice the toddler's approach. The wind seemed to hold its breath as Noah wobbled across the meadow, guided by a compassion beyond his years and an innocence that feared no danger. The fate of the forest hung in the balance as the unlikely hero moved forward, one small step at a time. Sarah's voice caught in her throat as she ran after her son, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. The distance between them seemed to stretch impossibly as Noah gained ground, his determination making him quicker than usual. "Noah, stop! Come back!" she called, her words carried away by a sudden gust of wind that rustled through the meadow. Mason spotted the toddler first, his arm freezing mid-throw as he clutched another stone. "Hey, there's a little kid," he warned the others, lowering his arm slowly. The children turned, their expressions shifting from excitement to confusion as they watched Noah toddle fearlessly toward them and the frightened cub. Emma stepped forward instinctively, as if to intercept the child before he reached the wild animal. "Stay back, kid," Zach called, scanning the tree line nervously. "There might be a mama bear around." But Noah paid them no mind. His focus remained fixed on Scout, who had stopped crying momentarily to observe the small human approaching. The cub's dark eyes reflected a mixture of fear and curiosity, its tiny nose twitching as it caught Noah's unfamiliar scent. From deeper in the forest, a low, rumbling growl emerged. The undergrowth at the edge of the meadow rustled ominously. Willow had heard her cub's distress calls and was coming, fast. "Oh, God," Sarah whispered, spotting the movement in the trees. She doubled her pace, desperate to reach her son before catastrophe struck. "Everyone get back," she shouted to the older children. "Move away from the cub." The children's faces drained of color as they too noticed the rustling bushes. Mason dropped his stick, his bravado evaporating in an instant. "Run!" he yelled, grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her back toward the forest path. But it was too late for a clean escape. Willow burst through the underbrush, her massive form a stark reminder of nature's raw power. Standing nearly 6 feet tall on her hind legs, the mother bear's eyes blazed with protective fury as she surveyed the scene. Her cub, trembling in the grass, surrounded by humans. Time seemed to slow. Sarah froze, her motherly instinct screaming at her to rush to Noah, but her rational mind warning that any sudden movement could trigger the bear's defensive attack. The children huddled together at the forest's edge, too terrified to run or speak. And Noah, sweet, innocent Noah, completely oblivious to the danger, continued his determined journey toward Scout. When he finally reached the frightened cub, he did something that made every witness hold their breath. He knelt down and held out his precious blue pacifier, offering his most treasured possession as a gift of peace. "It's okay," Noah said softly, his childish voice carrying clearly in the stillness that had fallen over the meadow. "No cry. Have my posse." Scout sniffed cautiously at the strange object, curiosity momentarily overriding fear. The cub's nose touched the silicone nipple, leaving a small smudge of dirt. Willow let out another growl, lower this time, and dropped to all fours. She began moving slowly toward her cub and the tiny human kneeling beside it, her intentions unclear, but her power undeniable. "Noah," Sarah called softly, forcing her voice to remain calm despite her terror. "Honey, don't move. Stay very still." But what happened next defied every expectation and every law of natural behavior. As Willow approached, Scout picked up Noah's pacifier in its mouth and turned toward its mother, making a soft grunting sound. The mother bear slowed her approach, her eyes moving between her cub and the small human. Noah, still kneeling, smiled up at the massive bear without a trace of fear. "Bear, Mommy," he said simply, pointing at Willow. "I, Noah." In that extraordinary moment, something unprecedented occurred. A connection formed between species, a bridge of understanding built by innocence and compassion. Willow stopped just feet away from Noah, her threatening posture gradually relaxing as she assessed this strange, fearless creature who had shown kindness to her cub. Sarah, paralyzed with fear, watched as her toddler reached out a tiny hand toward the mother bear. Her mind screamed in panic, but her body refused to move, as if some ancient instinct told her that any intervention now would shatter this fragile, impossible peace. Just when the tension had reached an unbearable peak, another sound broke the silence, the distinct crack of a branch snapping, followed by heavy footsteps approaching from the other side of the meadow. A tall figure emerged from the trees, dressed in the olive-green uniform of the Forest Service. Ranger Daniel Martinez, who had been tracking Willow and her cubs for weeks as part of a conservation study, stood motionless as he took in the scene before him. His hand instinctively moved to the tranquilizer gun at his hip, but he didn't draw it, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding, something that defied traditional human-wildlife interactions. "Nobody move," he called softly, his experienced eyes assessing the situation with professional calm despite his internal shock. "Stay exactly where you are." But the spell had already been broken. Willow's head snapped toward the new threat, her protective instincts flaring again. She let out a warning huff and quickly moved to Scout, nudging her cub with her nose. Scout, still clutching Noah's pacifier, hesitated for a moment, looking back at the toddler who had shown such unexpected kindness. Then, obeying its mother's urgent prompting, the cub turned and scampered after Willow as she retreated toward the forest. Just before disappearing into the trees, Willow paused and looked back at Noah, who was now standing, waving goodbye as if to a friend. The mother bear's gaze seemed to hold a message, perhaps gratitude, perhaps warning, perhaps something beyond human understanding. Then she was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the pines with Scout close behind, the blue pacifier still clutched in the cub's mouth. Sarah finally found her mobility again and ran to Noah, scooping him up in trembling arms and holding him so tightly he squirmed in protest. "Oh my God, Noah," she gasped, tears streaming down her face as she checked him for injuries. "You could have been killed. Never ever do that again." But Noah simply smiled, pointing to the forest where the bears had disappeared. "Bear friend," he declared happily, apparently untroubled by his near-death experience or the loss of his beloved pacifier. Ranger Martinez approached cautiously, his weathered face a mask of astonishment. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, his voice hushed with disbelief, "I've been working these woods for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Your boy just did something incredible." The children who had been tormenting Scout emerged slowly from the edge of the forest, their faces pale and expression subdued. Mason, who had been so bold earlier, looked ashamed as he approached Sarah and Noah. "We're sorry," he mumbled, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. "We didn't mean to scare the bear so bad." "You could have caused a tragedy," Sarah said sharply, her fear now turning to anger as the danger fully registered. "Wild animals are not toys, and that mother bear could have killed all of us to protect her cub." Emma stepped forward, tears welling in her eyes. "The baby was so brave," she said, looking at Noah with newfound respect. "He wasn't scared at all." "Sometimes children see things more clearly than we do," Ranger Martinez observed, gently ruffling Noah's hair. "They haven't learned fear or hatred yet." As the group made their way back to the cabin, with Ranger Martinez escorting the subdued children to ensure they returned safely to their camp, none of them noticed the pair of eyes watching from the forest edge. Behind a thick curtain of ferns, Willow observed their retreat. Scout nestled securely against her side, the blue pacifier still clutched in the cub's mouth like a treasured token. What happened in that meadow would soon become more significant than anyone could have imagined. The simple act of a toddler's compassion would ripple through the forest in ways that would challenge the boundary between human and animal worlds, starting a chain of events that would change the Whispering Pines forest forever. 3 days after the encounter in the meadow, Noah stood at his bedroom window, pressing his face against the glass as rain pattered softly against the roof. He missed his pacifier, though he hadn't cried for it as Sarah had expected. Each time she offered him a new one, she'd bought 3 different kinds from the general store in town, he would shake his head firmly. "Bear needs it," he would say with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Sarah had recounted the incredible story to her husband James when he returned from his business trip to the city. At first, he had been skeptical, then horrified at the danger his son had faced, and finally amazed as Ranger Martinez confirmed the extraordinary events. "It's not natural behavior," the ranger had explained when he stopped by the cabin the following day. "Bears, especially mothers with cubs, typically respond aggressively to perceived threats. What your boy did, and how Willow responded, it's unprecedented." "Could it happen again?" James had asked, his arm protectively around Sarah's shoulders. Ranger Martinez had shaken his head. "Lightning doesn't strike twice. I've advised the camp director to keep the children away from this section of the forest for the rest of the season, just to be safe. And I'd recommend you folks be extra cautious, too." But as Noah stared out at the rain-soaked forest, something moved at the tree line that made him press his small hands more firmly against the glass. A dark shape emerged from the shadows, followed by a smaller one. Even through the curtain of rain, there was no mistaking Willow and Scout as they cautiously approached the edge of the meadow. "Bear!" Noah cried excitedly, pointing. "Bear back!" Sarah, who had been folding laundry on Noah's bed, looked up sharply. "What?" She hurried to the window, her breath catching as she spotted the bears. "James!" she called, her voice tight with concern. James appeared in the doorway, his expression changing from questioning to alarm as he joined them at the window. "They shouldn't be here," he muttered, reaching for his phone. "The rain must have driven them closer to the cabin. I'll call Ranger Martinez." But Noah was already rushing for the stairs, determined to greet his forest friends. "Noah, no!" Sarah lunged for her son, catching him before he could reach the staircase. "We need to stay inside. It's not safe." Noah struggled against her hold, pointing insistently toward the window. "Bear brought something. Look." Sarah and James exchanged confused glances before returning to the window. What they saw next would become the second extraordinary chapter in an unfolding story that would eventually be shared around campfires and in conservation lectures for years to come. Scout had approached closer to the cabin than Willow, who remained vigilantly at the forest edge. In the cub's mouth was no longer just Noah's blue pacifier. Clutched alongside it was something red and round. An apple from the wild orchard deep in the forest. A peace offering from one world to another. Did they bring something to the cabin?" James whispered in disbelief. Sarah couldn't answer, her throat tight with emotion as she watched Scout carefully place both the pacifier and the apple on a flat rock at the edge of the yard, before retreating to its mother's side. Noah squirmed in Sarah's arms, pointing excitedly. "See? Bear friends, bear sharing." As the family watched in amazement, Willow nudged her cub, and both bears turned and disappeared back into the forest, leaving behind the apple and the now dirty blue pacifier. "This can't be happening," James murmured, rubbing his eyes as if he might be dreaming. "Bears don't bring gifts." But the evidence lay on the rock, visible even through the rain, proof that something unprecedented was occurring in Whispering Pines Forest, something that challenged everything humans thought they knew about the boundary between their world and the wild. The rain began to ease, patches of blue appearing between the clouds. A rainbow arched across the sky, one end seeming to touch the very spot where the bears had left their offering. "Can I get it, please?" Noah asked, his eyes wide with hope. "Bear, present for me." Sarah and James exchanged long looks, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, James nodded slowly. "I'll go with him," he said, his voice resolute though his expression betrayed his nervousness. "We'll be quick." Sarah bit her lip but didn't object. Something told her that this moment was important, that refusing Noah's request would somehow break a fragile thread that had been woven between their son and the forest. Hand in hand, father and son walked across the wet grass to the rock where the gifts lay. James scanned the tree line continuously, alert for any sign of the bear's return, while Noah confidently led the way, completely unafraid. When they reached the rock, Noah carefully picked up his pacifier, now marked with the imprint of Scout's teeth, and the perfectly round wild apple. He held the apple up to his father with a beaming smile. "For us," he said simply, "from bear friends." James, still struggling to process what was happening, nodded and took the apple, examining it with wonder. It was indeed a real apple, not something a bear would typically present to humans. As they turned to head back to the cabin, James spotted something that made him freeze. A small tuft of black fur caught on a bramble bush nearby, and beside it, a distinct paw print pressed into the mud. Proof that this extraordinary encounter had indeed happened. Inside the cabin, Sarah was already on the phone with Ranger Martinez, her voice animated as she described what they had witnessed. The ranger's initial disbelief gradually gave way to cautious interest as Sarah insisted on the truth of her account. "I know how it sounds," she said, watching through the window as James and Noah returned safely to the house. "But we have evidence. The apple, the pacifier with teeth marks, even fur and footprints. Something is happening here, something special." When James and Noah entered the kitchen, Noah proudly held up his reclaimed pacifier and placed the apple carefully on the table. Despite the dirt and obvious teeth marks on both items, Sarah felt no disgust, only a profound sense of wonder. "Ranger Martinez wants to come see for himself," she told James, covering the phone's microphone. "He sounds intrigued." James nodded, still looking slightly dazed. "He should. This is, well, I don't even know what this is." Noah, meanwhile, had climbed onto a chair and was examining his pacifier with interest rather than placing it back in his mouth as his parents might have expected. After a moment of contemplation, he set it aside and focused on the apple, pointing at it insistently. "Cut, please," he requested. "Share with bears later." Sarah and James exchanged another look, this one filled with growing amazement at their son's wisdom and compassion. Whatever was happening between Noah and the bears of Whispering Pines Forest was only beginning, and they sensed they were witnesses to something that transcended ordinary understanding. A connection that might change not just their lives, but the relationship between humans and wildlife in ways no one could yet imagine. As James carefully cut the apple into slices, setting aside half for the bears, as Noah instructed, Sarah finished her conversation with Ranger Martinez, who promised to arrive within the hour. Outside, the rainbow had faded, but the clouds had parted completely, allowing golden afternoon sunlight to bathe the meadow in a warm glow. Somewhere in the forest, a family of bears was returning to their den, having initiated a most unusual friendship that would soon draw the attention of more than just a forest ranger and a small family in a cabin. The story of Noah and the bears was about to spread far beyond Whispering Pines, challenging preconceptions and opening hearts to new possibilities of coexistence between the human and natural worlds. Ranger Martinez arrived just as the sun began its descent behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across the meadow. He parked his Forest Service truck at the edge of the gravel driveway and approached the cabin with measured steps, his expression a mixture of professional curiosity and barely concealed excitement. Sarah met him at the door, baby monitor in hand. "Noah just went down for his nap," she explained in a hushed voice. "The excitement wore him out." The ranger nodded understanding as James invited him inside. "I brought some equipment," he said, gesturing to the collection of tools hanging from his belt. "Thought I might take a look at those tracks and collect a sample of the fur." In the kitchen, Martinez examined the apple and pacifier with the careful attention of a scientist, turning them over in his gloved hands. "The tooth marks on both items are consistent with a black bear cub of Scout's age," he confirmed, using a small digital camera to document the evidence. "And you say they deliberately placed these items on the rock?" "Like they were leaving a gift," James affirmed, still sounding somewhat in disbelief of his own words. "The cub, Scout you called it, came right up to the edge of our yard. The mother stayed back by the trees watching." Martinez shook his head in amazement. "Willow is known to be particularly intelligent, even for a black bear. We've been tracking her for 3 seasons now, but this—" He gestured to the items on the table. "This is unprecedented behavior." Sarah poured coffee for them all, her mind racing with questions. "What does it mean? Is it safe for us to stay here? Safe for Noah?" The ranger took a thoughtful sip from his mug before answering. "Bears have excellent memory and recognition skills. It's possible that Willow recognizes your son as the child who showed kindness to her cub, As for whether it's safe, he sighed, setting down his mug. The honest answer is, I don't know. This behavior falls outside our understanding of normal bear conduct. James leaned forward, elbows on the kitchen table. So, what do we do? For now, maintain normal precautions. Keep your distance, secure your trash, don't leave food outside. Martinez hesitated, then added, But I'd like your permission to set up a wildlife camera facing that rock. If they return, when? Came a small voice from the doorway. Noah stood there in his dinosaur pajamas, clutching his blanket. Bears, come back soon. Sarah rose quickly. Noah, you should be napping. But Ranger Martinez was already kneeling to the toddler's eye level. His interest piqued. Why do you think they'll come back, Noah? Noah looked at the ranger with complete certainty. Bear friends now. I know. Martinez glanced up at Sarah and James, eyebrows raised. Children often have an intuitive understanding of animals that we adults lose, he said softly. I've seen it before. Bear, Mommy sad, Noah continued, approaching the table and pointing at the half-apple James had set aside. Her paw hurt. A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Finally, Martinez spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. How do you know that, Noah? The toddler shrugged, the gesture disarmingly adult. Saw it. Red on her foot. She walks funny. Martinez's face paled slightly. I've been tracking an injured bear for the past week. A female with cubs that rangers spotted limping near the eastern ridge. We thought it might be a different bear, but if Willow is injured... He pulled out his phone, scrolling rapidly through a series of images before finding what he sought. Did the mother bear's paw look like this, Noah? He showed the child a blurry image captured by a trail camera. It showed a black bear with a distinctive white patch on its chest, similar to Scout's marking, and its right front paw held slightly aloft, the fur around it matted and darker. Noah nodded without hesitation. Bear, Mommy hurt, needs help. Martinez sat back in his chair, looking stunned. This changes things. If Willow is the injured bear we've been tracking, and she's approaching human habitation instead of avoiding it. He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair. It's almost like she's seeking help. That's impossible, James said flatly. Bears don't seek out humans for medical assistance. Ordinarily, I'd agree with you, Martinez replied. But after what happened with your son and the pacifier, he gestured helplessly. We're in uncharted territory here. Sarah, who had been silent, suddenly spoke up. What if she is? What if somehow, through Noah, she's found a way to communicate that she needs help? The idea hung in the air, simultaneously absurd and strangely plausible in light of the events of the past few days. I can't officially endorse that theory, Martinez said slowly, but unofficially. He glanced at Noah, who was now examining the apple slices with great interest. I've worked with wildlife long enough to know there are things we don't understand. A plan began to form, tentative at first, then with growing conviction. With the family's permission, Ranger Martinez would install wildlife cameras around the property. If Willow returned, they would have video evidence of her behavior, and perhaps, just perhaps, they might find a way to help the injured mother bear without endangering anyone, human or animal. As Martinez prepared to leave, equipment in hand to collect samples from the site where the bears had left their gifts, an unexpected visitor arrived. A black SUV with the logo of the regional news station pulled into the driveway, and a woman with a sleek ponytail and determined expression stepped out. Cameraman in tow. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, she called, approaching the porch where they stood with the ranger. I'm Alexis Winters from Channel 7 News. We received a tip about an unusual bear encounter at your property. Care to comment?" Sarah and James exchanged alarmed glances. Martinez stepped forward, his posture suddenly official. "This is a Forest Service matter, ma'am. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave." Alexis was undeterred. "Our source says a toddler gave his pacifier to a bear cub and somehow started a communication between species. Is that your son?" She pointed to Noah, who had wandered onto the porch, still clutching an apple slice. "Who told you that?" Sarah demanded, pulling Noah protectively behind her. "The children from Camp Pinewood have been talking about it nonstop. One of the counselors called our tip line." Alexis smiled, her expression friendly but her eyes calculating. "It's a beautiful story, the kind that could go viral overnight." Martinez stepped between the reporter and the family. "Miss Winters, this is a delicate wildlife situation that requires discretion, not publicity. These bears are wild animals, not characters in a fairy tale. But if it's true," Alexis pressed, "it could change how people view wildlife conservation. Think of the impact." Before anyone could respond, a distant crash echoed from the forest edge, followed by the distinctive huff of a bear. Everyone froze, heads turning toward the sound. At the tree line, partially obscured by shadows, stood Willow. Even from a distance, her labored posture was evident. She was indeed favoring her right front paw. Beside her, Scout peered curiously at the gathered humans. "Oh my God," Alexis whispered, as her cameraman swung his equipment toward the bears. "Don't move," Martinez cautioned, his voice low and steady. No sudden movements, no loud noises. But Noah had already spotted his forest friends. Before anyone could stop him, he darted forward, apple slice still in hand, and waved enthusiastically. "Bear! Hi, bear!" Time seemed to freeze as Noah's small figure stood outlined against the setting sun, waving at the enormous wild predator at the edge of the forest. Sarah bit back a scream, every maternal instinct screaming to rush forward and snatch her child to safety. What happened next would be the lead story on every news channel across the country by morning. As the cameraman captured every moment, Willow slowly, painfully, made her way forward into the meadow. She stopped a respectful distance from Noah, lowering her massive head to look at the child eye to eye. Noah, displaying that same fearless compassion that had started this extraordinary chain of events, held out his apple slice. "For you," he said clearly. "Make better." And then, as the assembled adults watched in stunned silence, Willow carefully, delicately, took the apple slice from Noah's tiny hand, her movement gentle as a mother handling her own cub. The footage went viral within hours. By dawn the next day, the Bennett cabin was surrounded by news vans, wildlife experts, and curious onlookers, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the bear whisperer Toddler and the injured mother bear who had seemingly sought human help. The unexpected publicity created immediate complications. Wildlife officials from the State Conservation Department arrived by mid-morning, their expressions grave as they convened an impromptu meeting with Ranger Martinez and the Bennett family in the suddenly crowded living room of the cabin. "This situation presents unprecedented challenges," explained Dr. Eleanor Chen, the department's chief wildlife veterinarian, as she reviewed the footage of Willow's interaction with Noah for the third time. "Protocol dictates that an injured bear approaching human habitation should be tranquilized and relocated, or, in severe cases, euthanized." "Euthanized?" Sarah gasped, instinctively pulling Noah closer on her lap. "But she hasn't shown any aggression." "On the contrary," added Dr. Leonard Michaels, a renowned animal behaviorist who had driven through the night from the State University after seeing the news. What we're observing here appears to be a form of cross-species communication that defies our current understanding of wildlife behavior. Outside, the crowd continued to grow. Local police had been called in to establish a perimeter around the property, keeping the media and onlookers at a safe distance from both the cabin and the forest edge where Willow and Scout might appear. James paced the living room, his face haggard from a sleepless night. What are our options here? This is our home, our son. We need to know if we're in danger. Dr. Chen exchanged glances with Martinez before responding. We've consulted with experts across the country since receiving Ranger Martinez's report last night. The consensus is that this situation is unprecedented but potentially valuable from a research perspective. Research? Sarah repeated, a note of protective anger in her voice. My son is not a research subject. Of course not, Dr. Michaels interjected smoothly. But this connection he's established with Willow could provide insights into animal cognition and interspecies communication that could revolutionize conservation efforts. Noah, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room, was drawing on a sheet of paper, creating what appeared to be crude illustrations of bears and humans holding hands. Martinez cleared his throat. There's another factor to consider. The footage clearly shows Willow's injury. It appears to be an infected wound, possibly from a trap some poacher set illegally. Without treatment, she could lose the paw, or worse. Can't you tranquilize her and treat the wound? James asked. Ordinarily, yes, Dr. Chen replied. But tranquilizing a mother bear with cubs is high risk. If the dose isn't precisely calibrated, it could be fatal. And separating her from her cubs, even temporarily, would cause extreme stress. Noah looked up from his drawing. Bear's coming back, he announced calmly, as if stating that the sun would rise tomorrow. Bear, Mommy wants help. The adults fell silent, all eyes turning to the toddler who seemed to possess an understanding that eluded the experts. Dr. Michaels knelt beside Noah. How do you know that, little one? Did the bear tell you somehow? Noah nodded solemnly. In here, he said, pointing to his chest. I know. Outside, a commotion arose as one of the police officers rushed toward the cabin. Martinez met him at the door, their hushed conversation punctuated by urgent gestures toward the forest. They're back, Martinez announced, turning to the room. Willow and Scout are at the edge of the clearing, and they've brought something else. The entire group moved to the windows. Doctor. Chen, removing a pair of binoculars from her bag to get a better look. It appears to be some kind of plant material, she said with growing excitement. Wild yarrow, if I'm not mistaken. It's known for its antibacterial properties. Are you suggesting the bear brought medicinal plants? James asked incredulously. Dr. Michaels was already making notes on his tablet. Native cultures have long observed bears self-medicating with specific plants. There's scientific documentation of bears in the Yellowstone region, seeking out osha root for its antimicrobial properties. Bear medicine, Noah said simply, returning to his drawing. Sarah looked down at her son, then back at the bears at the forest edge. What if Willow is trying to show us what she needs? The idea seemed fantastical, but no more so than anything else that had happened over the past days. After a brief, intense discussion, a plan was formulated. Using Noah's inexplicable connection with the bears as a bridge, they would attempt to help Willow without resorting to tranquilizers or separation from her cubs. The stakes were enormous. If successful, they might not only save Willow's injured paw but also document a level of animal intelligence and cross-species cooperation previously thought impossible. If they failed, the consequences could be deadly for both bears and humans. As the wildlife team prepared the necessary medical supplies and set up a safe observation perimeter, Sarah and James sat with Noah, trying to explain in simple terms what would happen next. "The bear mommy needs doctors to look at her hurt paw," Sarah explained gently. "But she's afraid of grown-ups." Noah nodded, completely understanding. "Not afraid of me." "That's right," James affirmed, his voice tight with suppressed fear for what they were about to attempt. "But it's very important that you listen to Ranger Martinez and do exactly what he says. Can you promise that?" Noah nodded solemnly. "Help bear mommy." The plan was risky but simple. Noah, accompanied by his parents and Ranger Martinez, would approach the edge of the meadow where Willow and Scout waited. Dr. Chen and her veterinary team would follow at a distance, ready to provide medical assistance if Willow allowed it. The media and other onlookers would be kept well back, and sharpshooters from the wildlife department would be positioned as a last resort if things went catastrophically wrong. As they stepped onto the porch, the gravity of what they were attempting hung heavy in the air. Sarah knelt and hugged Noah fiercely. "I love you so much," she whispered, fighting back tears. "It okay, Mama," Noah said with that strange ancient wisdom that had guided him from the beginning. "Bears, friends." The small procession made its way slowly across the meadow. Noah walked between his parents, each holding one of his hands, while Martinez walked slightly ahead, moving with the deliberate calm of someone approaching wild animals. At the forest edge, Willow watched their approach, her massive body tense but not threatening. Scout peeked out from behind her, the cub's curiosity evident in its alert posture. When they were about 20 feet away, Martinez signaled for them to stop. "This is close enough," he said quietly. "Let's see what happens next." Noah looked up at his mother questioningly. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah nodded, and they released his hands. "Stay where we can see you," she instructed, her voice barely audible. With slow, deliberate steps, Noah walked forward alone, crossing the invisible boundary between human safety and wild uncertainty. The entire meadow fell silent, even the birds seeming to hold their songs as the extraordinary scene unfolded. "Hi, Bear," Noah said when he was about 10 feet from Willow. "I help your Owie." Willow huffed softly, her dark eyes fixed on the child. She shifted her weight, exposing her injured paw more clearly. Even from a distance, the wound was visibly infected, the fur around it matted with blood and pus. Noah pointed back at Dr. Chen and her team. "Doctors, help. Make better." It was impossible to know if Willow understood the specific words, but something in Noah's tone or body language seemed to communicate his intent. The bear remained still, watching as Noah slowly turned and waved at the veterinary team. Dr. Chen approached with painstaking slowness, medical kit in hand, her years of training warring with the unprecedented nature of what she was attempting. "This defies every protocol," she murmured to Martinez as she passed him. "But I can see the wound clearly now. Without treatment, sepsis will set in soon." What followed was a tense, delicate dance of trust and instinct. With Noah as an intermediary, sometimes speaking soft reassurances to Willow, sometimes simply standing as a bridge between two worlds, Dr. Chen was able to approach close enough to assess the wound properly. "It's definitely from a trap," she confirmed after several minutes of observation. "The metal has caused a deep puncture and there's significant infection. She needs antibiotics and the wound needs cleaning." The question was how to administer treatment to a fully conscious wild bear. Traditional methods would involve tranquilizers, but Willow's trust seemed precarious, balanced on the knife edge of Noah's inexplicable connection with her. "I have an idea," Dr. Michaels said suddenly, having joined them at a safe distance. Bears have an extraordinarily strong sense of smell. If we could mask the antibiotics in something appealing, honey perhaps, like a spoonful of sugar, Sarah murmured, remembering countless negotiations to get Noah to take medicine when he was younger. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. It could work. We have oral antibiotics that could be mixed with honey and spread on apples, for the wound cleaning. She hesitated. That's trickier. Noah, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Water play. The adults looked at him in confusion until Sarah's eyes widened in understanding. The sprinkler. Noah loves playing in the sprinkler on hot days. Martinez caught on immediately. A gentle spray could help clean the wound without requiring direct contact. It's unorthodox, but then again, this entire situation is unorthodox. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting warm light across the meadow, an extraordinary scene unfolded. A child's sprinkler, hastily retrieved from the cabin's storage shed, was set up at the forest edge. Noah, laughing with delight, demonstrated for Willow and Scout how to play in the cool water, running through the gentle spray. Scout, with a cub's natural curiosity, was the first to investigate, cautiously pawing at the water before darting playfully through the spray. And then, in a moment that Dr. Michaels declared would rewrite textbooks on animal behavior, Willow limped forward and allowed the water to run over her injured paw, the clear liquid turning pink as it washed away dirt and debris from the wound. Once the wound was cleaner, Dr. Chen prepared the antibiotic-laced honey on apple slices, which Noah carefully offered to Willow. The bear sniffed the treated fruit suspiciously at first, but hunger or trust eventually won out, and she consumed every piece. We'll need to continue the antibiotics for at least 10 days, Dr. Chen explained to Sarah and James, as they watched Noah sitting peacefully just feet away from the massive predator and her cub. And I'd like to try a topical treatment tomorrow, if Willow returns. She'll come back, Noah said confidently, reaching out to gently pat Scout's head as the cub ventured closer. By late afternoon, as Willow and Scout retreated back into the forest, the mother bear, moving with slightly less pain after the wound cleaning, the story had evolved from a local curiosity to an international sensation. Bear Whisperer Toddler was trending across social media platforms, and offers for exclusive interviews were pouring in from major networks. We need to talk about what happens next, Martinez said gravely as they returned to the cabin. This story is bigger than any of us anticipated. There will be pressure from all sides, media wanting access, researchers wanting to study the phenomenon, tourists wanting to see the bears. We just want our normal life back, Sarah said, exhaustion evident in her voice, and we want what's best for Willow and Scout. Dr. Michael cleared his throat. There's another consideration. If word spreads about a friendly bear in these woods, it could create dangerous situations. Not all bears are like Willow, and not all children are like Noah. If people start approaching bears expecting this kind of interaction, the implications hung heavily in the room. The miracle they had witnessed could, if misunderstood, lead to tragedy for both humans and bears. As the adults debated the complex ethical and practical considerations, Noah sat at the kitchen table, drawing picture after picture of bears and humans together in harmony. In his simple childish illustrations was a vision of coexistence that the adults around him were struggling to translate into reality. Unknown to everyone in the cabin, deep in the forest, Willow was leading Scout to a new den, farther from the human settlement than their previous one. The mother bear moved with new purpose, her injured paw already responding to the treatment. In Scout's mouth was a treasured possession, the blue pacifier that had started it all, now an unlikely symbol of a bridge between two worlds. The story of Noah and the bears was just beginning, its implications rippling outward like circles in a pond, touching lives far beyond the meadow where a toddler had first offered his most precious possession to a frightened cub. What would grow from this extraordinary seed of connection remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. The boundary between human and animal had been forever altered in Whispering Pines Forest.